The first step in the Better Talks model is called the Takeoff. The Takeoff is simply the introduction to your talk, to your message. There's two things you really want to accomplish in the Takeoff. You want to connect with your audience, and you want to connect the topic that you're going to be preaching on with yourself. And so during the Takeoff, you're getting up there, you're setting yourself up, and you're leaning into your message. And I just want to give you 5 tips for the Takeoff. And the first tip is this: when it comes to your Takeoff, start strong. Don't get up there and limp into your talk. I've seen sometimes preachers get up there and they get the microphone and they spend the first few minutes of their talk looking down. They're moving their papers around. They're kind of they're doing like this. They're getting set up and they're kind of making sort of like peripheral, not really important comments, things that don't really advance the message, or just kind of like almost mumbling under their breath. When you get up there to speak, get up, take the time, get your notes set, take a breath, and start strong and go right into your message. And resist the urge, by the way, to recap with great detail where you've been in previous weeks. I know that, I'm like you probably. I like to preach in series. I love the way series all kind of work together. There's a lot of thought put into that. But that's probably a lot more interesting to us as communicators than it is to the audience. And so sometimes I'll listen to somebody and they're 10 minutes into their message and they haven't even really got into this week's message. They've spent 10 minutes recapping where they've been for the last 10 weeks. And so while it might be worth mentioning, hey, we're in week 8 of this series where we're talking about this, that's great. But don't bog down there too much. Don't re-preach last week's message, because it's going to make everyone in the room feel like, well, why did I come last week if I was going to hear it again this week? And in this day and age where people can go online and listen to you or watch you and kind of catch up even if they weren't there on a certain Sunday. So start strong. The second tip is this: memorize your Takeoff. Out of the 6 steps in this Better Talks model, I think this step is the one that's most important to memorize. Because remember, one of your primary goals with the Takeoff is to connect with your audience. And the key to connecting with your audience is to not to be buried behind your pulpit or your table or whatever you're preaching from, or your notes or your iPad. The key to connecting with people is to get out from behind your table or your pulpit or your stand, to move around a little bit, to be on the front edge of the stage, and to make eye contact, to be present, to be warm, to be engaging in the room. It's really important that you know what your Takeoff is so you're not stuck behind your notes when your message begins. And this is especially important, by the way, if your Takeoff is a story. And it's even more important if it's a personal story. Sometimes I see communicators and they're telling stories that happen to them, but they're using their notes. And it doesn't come across as genuine or authentic. In fact, you might even be wondering, did this story happen to you or not? Because if you and I are sitting down having coffee together and I'm telling you about a conversation that I had with a stranger last week, I don't say, oh, I got this great story to tell you. Hold on, let me get my notes out. I get my notes in front of me and then I start to tell you this story. Similar, when you're up there preaching, if it's a personal story, just trust that you know the story because you lived through it. Maybe write it out in your preparation because it might help you think through the order of the story. But when you go to actually deliver it, don't read it, memorize it. Third tip: often the best way, speaking of stories, often the best way to start a message is with a personal story and with something maybe that's relatively recent. And one of the ways that you'll be able to come up with more stories is the sooner you realize what you're preaching on that Sunday, the more your mind is kind of tuned into your topic, the more the things that you see during the course of that week, you're gonna realize the connection between those things and what you're going to talk about. So I plan my sermon series well in advance. But every Monday when I get into the office, one of the first things I do is I go to my notes and just remind myself, here's my text for this upcoming week. Here's kind of the theme of the text. And then that allows me to kind of have my antenna up, my radar up for the rest of the week, looking and listening for stories. But personal stories are wonderful ways to start your message, especially stories that are reveal something about yourself, a funny observation about the world. They say that we impress people with our strengths, but we connect with people out of our weaknesses. And so it's not about telling stories that make you look awesome. Sometimes the stories where you look a little bit silly actually are the ones that really endear you to your audience. And so personal stories, maybe you're wondering, well, I'm not a great storyteller. How do I get better at telling stories? It is a craft. I do think it is something that people sometimes are naturally great at and naturally not so great at. But I also think, like most things, it's a skill you can get better at and you can develop. And so some of my recommendations would be listen to other great storytellers, listen to other preachers who are great at telling stories. Judah Smith is one guy who comes to mind who's just a really great storyteller. Of course, he's got his own unique style. You can't be him, but you can learn things from him. Rich Wilkerson Jr. is a gifted storyteller. There's other guys around that are like that, and ladies. Listen to podcasts. Something that might seem weird is listening and watching comedians do their stand-up act, as long as you can handle the content of what they're saying. But the way they tell stories, from their pacing to their timing to their tone, it's usually great. So you'll learn things that way. Watch TED Talks and look at how people use a limited amount of time to accomplish the most. So opening up with a story. The fourth tip is this. Sometimes what makes a great takeoff is actually the story before the story. So let me give you an example of what I mean. If I'm preaching a message on mission and why we live on mission, I might want to talk about these two young men that were affected by a missions trip we took in the early 2000s to Belfast, Northern Ireland. Their names were Maddie and Clarky, and they placed their trust in Jesus when we were there. And then when we went back the next time, they were serving as youth leaders in their local church. And it was so emotional for us to be able to see the fruit of the ministry in their lives. And while that's a great story, it's not necessarily a funny story. It's not necessarily an opening story. So what I would do if I want to talk about Maddie and Clarky is I would tell a story about something funny that happened on that trip first. So I might say, hey, while we were in Belfast, Northern Ireland, we went and got breakfast and we had blood sausage. And do you know what's in blood sausage? And start talking about something like that. Or talk about an embarrassing thing that happened when I was trying to play soccer, or some sort of cultural snafu that happened. And then after I kind of tell that funny, engaging, relatable story where I'm a little bit silly, then I'll say something like this. While we were in Belfast, we met these two young men. And that's the story I actually want to get to, but I've told the story before the story so that I can be engaging and interesting and draw the crowd in so that I can get to the story that's actually going to segue into the rest of the message. And that leads me to my fifth tip when it comes to the takeoff. Be sure that you connect your story to the topic. A funny story that doesn't have anything to do with your message, an engaging story that doesn't actually move your message forward is not a great use of your time. And eventually your audience will realize he or she is just telling funny stories, but it actually doesn't have anything to do with the message. Make sure that the story you choose actually can make a connection to the next step that we want to get to, which is the tension. And we'll talk about the tension in the next video.